space. Okay, so we'll get started. By the way, for all of our speakers, there is a button that's in light green on your right. Push it. If it's red, that means you can speak. And speak right into the microphone, please.
Here, I'll hold it.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Hiba Siddiqui, and this past summer I had the great privilege to work with Project Starling and a member state to track the negotiations for the summit. My generation is well acquainted with the issues that plague our world today. From our fear of the effects of climate change to looming threats against global security, we understand that challenges such as these cannot be solved alone. We hope that now is a time where global leaders work with one another to pave the way for a renewed and revitalized form of international cooperation. During these negotiations, I have watched the world come together to collaborate, imagine, and to strive to craft a future in which humanity can thrive. But this is the start of a process, and without upholding the commitments made, the momentum we have created at the summit will be lost. It is vital for leaders to see the summit not as an end, but as a beginning. This is why I am incredibly excited to kick off today's event, which demonstrates how networked multilateralism can track and fulfill the commitments we are making at the summit. Through collaboration between member states, think tanks, and NGOs, I hope we do not let all the work that we have achieved at the Summit of the Future remain merely words on a page, but that we take each and every step to make a better future for my generation and generations beyond. I am now honored to introduce our first speaker, the distinguished senator from Uruguay, Carmen Sanguinetti. Senator Sanguinetti was elected to Congress in the year 2020. Prior to that, she has had 15 years of experience working with civil society organizations in New York and Uruguay to defend the rights of people with disabilities and educational inclusion as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm thrilled to share this space in such an important event. The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell. Those words by former UN Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld remain totally valid today, as this is exactly what we are striving to achieve at this Summit of the Future, in a context of a highly polarized world and increasing violations to international norms. However, we have to be aware of another proverb that remains valid in this context. And this is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. To avoid that the summit and the Pact of the Future become just another example of good intentions, we need a strong follow-up and accountability mechanisms, not just among member states, but especially between the state institutions and their citizens. And for that, the role of civil society and think tank, as you very well know, is crucial. Nowhere are the consequences of the triple planetary crisis, of the increasing levels of violence and armed conflicts more acute than in the global south where I come from. However, we won't be able to fully contribute to their solution without international cooperation. Therefore, we are in a front of timely opportunity to bring together the UN, member states, and stakeholders from the global south and the global north in order to collaborate and make sure that the commitments that we are collectively and individually assuming are respected. Despite all the pitfalls, a stronger rules-based multilateral system is an essential part of the answer. This doesn't mean stronger intergovernmentalism, but a broader and more inclusive idea of what multilateralism means. One that includes space for collaboration with non-governmental actors. In Uruguay, we see ourselves as a bridge-building nation within our region and between the global north and south. Therefore, we stand ready to be part of a coalition of bridge-building actors that can generate traction on the fulfillment of our commitments, a geographically and politically diverse coalition, including developed and developing nations, as well as non-governmental actors gathered around a shared purpose, avoiding the dominance of the us versus them narrative, taking into account the different concerns and points of view, and going beyond the rigidity of traditional regional or political groups. Finally, as we start thinking on how to put into practice the follow-up mechanism, I would like to encourage that when we do this, we force ourselves to leave the UN bubble from time to time, or whatever bubble each one of us belong to experience directly the challenges faced by those who are dealing with the global problems in their own communities, to change the dynamics so we can listen more to the merits of an idea or initiative rather than to fall in the predictable, over-polarized and politicized debates that we are so used to have. And if moving this mountain is too heavy and difficult, let's bring the voices of these people to New York. Let's make it a practice to listen to the voices of those affected by conflict or crisis. I'm sure that they will be able to move mountains. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Mintu Pham. I will be a very light moderator today. I'm the CEO of Project Starling, a new think and do tank to try to bring people together to solve global problems. And we try to build networks, including here, as you'll see, the speakers today are part of a loose coalition of think tanks and NGOs who really care about global cooperation. And we are coming together today to try to harvest the seeds that are coming out of the Summit of the Future and see how we can work together to track progress and assess progress over the coming months and years. So with that, let me hand the floor over to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is probably not a stranger to any of you in this room. I call her the mother of networked multilateralism. And this event is From Words to Action, a networked approach to upholding commitments from the Summit of the Future. Anne-Marie.
Mintu, thank you. And I think part of my job is to speak for only 4 minutes, so that person with the clock, please raise it up at least when I have a minute left to go. You don't have to hold it up the whole time. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm feeling a little on the more senior side. Not only do I have lots of students here, but there are students of my students here. So I'm feeling, but I do want to talk about networked multilateralism, and I want to talk in my capacity not only as CEO of New America, but as a member of the high-level advisory board on networked multilateralism. So when the Secretary General issued our common agenda in 2021, which he had been requested to do at the 75th anniversary of the UN, that called for networked multilateralism, and what he meant by that was expanding intergovernmentalism, expanding it to include all of us, but also faith groups, corporate actors, essentially non-state actors, which is always a problem because we're defining them by what they're not, but I think of global actors. I think it's fair to say that that vision of multilateralism was not universally welcomed on the part of all the member states. Certainly, as a member of the high-level advisory board, we talked about that. Not all, we were a board who reflected the population of the world, only 12 members, but many, I think, people felt, no, this is still really for the member states, and indeed, there are not enough member states included. I am very happy to see that in the Pact for the Future, the draft that I have seen, I think the vision of networked multilateralism is alive and well. It pledges a new beginning in multilateralism, and it says that our multilateral system and its institutions must be just, democratic, equitable, and representative of today's world, inclusive, interconnected, and financially stable. As the lawyer I am, I went down, and inclusive is defined as to allow the meaningful participation of all relevant stakeholders in appropriate formats, while reaffirming the intergovernmental character of the United Nations. And then further, in terms of strengthening partnerships, national parliaments and relevant stakeholders, local authorities, indigenous peoples, civil society, business and the private sector, faith-based organizations, the scientific and academic communities, and all people to ensure an effective response to our collective challenge. That is really quite remarkable in an official UN document. You cannot imagine the charter in 1945, even though, of course, member states talk about the peoples of the world. Still, it is a an entirely member state organization. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 4 years later, yes, we're getting there. But this, to me, is very important. That is how many minutes? Aha, okay, good, I'm on. So, again, there's always going to be that tension, and there's plenty of places where, in fact, the central importance of nation states is reaffirmed, but we have been invited to the table. And that is really why we're all here now, to figure out how we make this all of our pact, and how we hold ourselves accountable, as well as member states, how we do that in our domestic spaces. New America is probably 2/3, 3/4 domestic, as well as global, and how we then do it as a global community, a term that is often used, often denied that it exists, but if it's anywhere, it's here. So I would just close by saying, when we think about a pact of the future, a summit of the future, who's the future? Well, it certainly includes all of us, and it includes those who come after us. So this accountability is up to us. And I have to end by complimenting Mintu on the name of this project, Project Starling. I'm a passionate birder. If you have never seen a murmuration of starlings, look it up on the web, and I hope you get to see it. It is an extraordinary, swooping, graceful ballet of birds who are simply moving in relation to one another without a grand plan, but they actually get to where they're going. So thank you very much.
I'm very embarrassed, but thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. That's the purpose of being here, is how do we work together to make this real? And that this pact, making it about all of us, and what you said about leaving the bubble is so important. And so that's what this effort is. And now we're going to go into, what does the pact actually say? I know there's a little bit of uncertainty as to where this will land, but we know that we will have a pact. And we know 99.99999% of what it's going to say. And so my colleagues here will speak to each section of the pact. And I won't have them go deep into their introductions. They are all incredibly talented people who run in very important organizations, but you'll see their affiliations on our screen. So first, we're going to go to Chapter 1 of the Pact, which is about sustainable development and financing. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Betty Winaina from NYU CIC.
Is it working now? Yes. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. So I'll start on Chapter 1 and begin by saying, as global leaders converge for the Summit of the Future, there is general consensus that these are precarious times. The current situation calls for economic solidarity as a fundamental pillar that, if left and reinforced, will not only threaten stability of member states, but also our collective stability as a global system. The future of the rule-based order world order, and exacerbate geopolitical fragmentation. The summit and its attendant pact therefore holds great responsibility, and we look forward to its conclusion very soon, in restoring confidence that multilateral, intergovernmental decision-making can deliver for global humanity. The recommitment to achieving the SDGs, leaving no one behind, through revitalized partnerships, provides a much-needed signal that people-centered cooperation is an imperative. The need to unlock the much-needed financial resources to make this possible is well acknowledged in the version of the Pact that I've been able to read. The Pact rightly notes that this will include delivering additional flows into the pipeline through means such as enhanced ODA, commitments and concessional financing, increasing domestic resource mobilization, and catalyzing private sector investment and financing. On the other hand, it also recognizes that sealing loopholes and creating efficiencies towards fair distribution of tax from economic activities, stemming of illicit financial flows, and addressing the runaway debt situation will result in savings in the system that constitute financial gains. Whilst there's been more talk about the role of MDBs in unlocking this much-needed financing, there's an opportunity to reiterate that ODA is probably the most important lever that can unlock all the others. ODA is crucial in driving the reforms that will increase capital adequacy in the multilateral development banks, that can deliver concessional financing for less developed and debt-distressed countries, as well as support middle-income countries invest in global public goods. Targeted ODA can also support countries to increase their domestic resource mobilization through assistance with reforms, capacity building, alongside strengthened international tax cooperation and stemming of illicit financial flows. The link with catalyzing private sector investment and supporting deeper, meaningful trade through integration is also noted. The elaboration of these linkages in the 4th Financing for Development Conference next year will therefore be an imperative. Going forward, we all need to keep reminding donors that using ODA to stimulate sustainable financing makes good business sense in the long run. For this to be possible, data needs to be generated in a way that tracking this will be possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. Amitabh Behar, Executive Director of Oxfam International.
Thank you, Mintu, and thank you for bringing all of us together as a demonstration of the networked initiative. Really appreciate that. But I just wanted to remind you, Mintu, that you and I am sure many of us here before 2015 were doing an initiative called The World We Want. I'm sure everybody remembers that. That's 2014, I think. This is 24. And in 1924, we are seeing, after decades, hunger actually grow. This is the time when the top 1% have added 42 trillion to their kitty. The top 5 billionaires have doubled their wealth. 5 billion people have become poorer. The climate catastrophe is not about the future. It's happened today. So is this the world we want? Certainly not. And therefore, this is really a critical moment. And I really hope that when the Secretary General says that this is a generational opportunity, we can take that. But the current version of the Pact does not really reflect that. It seems like a much more diluted version, and therefore this networked pressure is critical. Coming to the chapter 1, looking at the financing for development, I would really say that this is time for moving from words to action. On financing, we have heard empty rhetoric for very long. And this is really the moment where we must ensure that we regain trust in multilateralism, but we need to see real resources, whether it's for climate financing, whether it's for the SDG gaps. So it is very, very critical that we need to link now the Summit for Future with the COP29, with the Financing for Development Conference. And in this, few of the things that we hope that should certainly be delivered is an ambitious international Financing for Development Conference. We hope that people recognize that the North and South is also a strong financial divide now. And that financial divide needs to be bridged. And we just heard of some of ways how it could be bridged, but that's critical. And it would also be important, particularly for certainly Oxfam, but the thousands of partners we work with, a whole range of actors in the South, that inequality is taken on head on. So it is the political economy which is really making the rich richer, needs to be busted. And that could be done by taxing the rich, by taxing the super wealthy, and that's happening. In G20, it seems possible. The tax convention, UN tax convention, is actually looking at it. So this is really the moment where we'll need to demonstrate action around financing for development, and we'll need to have a much greater ambition. Otherwise, it remains a hollow network, and this is the time where we need to bring people's power, given that the network governance idea is much broader, to hold power to account. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amitabh. And last year was the SDGs declaration, the halfway mark. People are already starting to talk about the next set of goals that come after this. And clearly we still need to, as you say, focus on the now as well on that agenda. Next, we'll talk about peace and security, which is a significant, I think, highlight. Hopefully, I'll let my colleagues talk about that, but which is a significant part of this agenda. A lot of people look to the UN to be trying to keep or maintain international peace and security. That is its #1 objective. And so this part of the Pact addresses that. Richard Gowan from the International Crisis Group.
Thank you, Mintu. I will comment on Chapter 2 of the Pact, which focuses on peace and security, but I'll also make some comments on Chapter 5, which addresses institutional reform. And I think that some of the most interesting elements of the Pact regarding security are actually in Chapter 5. This includes an unexpectedly robust set of parameters and guidelines for discussing Security Council reform, less specific but good language on the need to strengthen the role of the General Assembly in peace and security, something which is also a topic of a new report from the UN University entitled Assembly for Peace. And then there's reasonably ambitious language on reforming the peace-building architecture and the Peace-Building Commission, which is going to be in focus in 2025. The Pact sets out a pretty clear set of pathways for negotiations on rebooting the main intergovernmental organs dealing with peace and security issues. True, Security Council reform negotiations may prove to be a road to nowhere, but at least we have a better map. Turning back to Chapter 2, it has got to be said that much of Chapter 2 on peace and security is quite weak, but there are some useful hooks in the text for policy development. I would highlight that the Pact does recognize the importance of the UN supporting national prevention strategies, which I think is an interesting opening for violence reduction efforts. The call for a Secretary General's review on UN peacekeeping operations is timely, given the difficulties the UN has faced in places like Mali. And the call for a 4th special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament creates a window for our arms control colleagues to do interesting things. There are some paragraphs we should celebrate for existing at all, even if the substance is pretty thin. There's language on prevention that is vague, but at least it is there. Similarly, the language on nuclear disarmament is not strong enough, but again, at least it is there. Sadly, though, we have to mourn the fact that member states decided in the final days to remove the reference to climate and peace, which I think is a significant loss. So it's not perfect, but the senator quoted Dag Hammarskjöld. I will quote my favorite authority on how to work at the UN, who is Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might just find you'll get what you need.
Thank you, Richard. Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor of Singapore. And let me say that Singapore in these negotiations have been so heroic in pulling together small states, in speaking for multilateral cooperation, and really being such a positive and constructive force in these negotiations. Ambassador Ghafoor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ming Tu. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'll start with Elvis Presley, a little less conversation and a little more action. And I want to say, as a diplomat who has spent a lot of time in the basement of this building, negotiating words with other diplomats, that I'm guilty as charged. But I think there is a determination to get things done. And this determination comes from a lot of countries, especially the smaller countries, who really see the multilateral system as an existential vehicle to forge cooperation, but also to deliver action. So I want to say that on our part, like a murmuration of starlings, the small states of the world are organized and determined to not only strengthen the multilateral system, but to get to action. So that leads me to the Pact of the Future. And I think Richard Gowan has covered some of the points that I wanted to make, but a few additional thoughts. First of all, it was in this very room 6 months ago, when this room was filled as it is today, that we agreed on a high seas treaty. So the UN can get things done, even if the geopolitical context is severely challenged as it is now. And that gives me hope that the Pact of the Future, when it's adopted, and I say when, even though the negotiations, I have to confess, are still ongoing, will mark a new chapter among nations of the world in international cooperation. The first thing I want to say is that if you look at the sequence of the 5 chapters, there is a certain logic to that, because the foundation of peace and security has to be sustainable development. So let's accept that inequality is a driver of conflict, inequality within countries, inequality between nations. So the whole chapter 1 is the foundation for chapter 2. I think that came out very strongly in the negotiations and the discussions, and I think we have to preserve that. Second, in the pact is embedded the idea of a new agenda for peace. But what is the new agenda for peace is an open window. And that gives not only the diplomats, but civil society, and so many of you are represented here, and I have to say it's really energizing to be in the company of civil society, that you have to remain engaged to shape this discussion as to what constitutes the new agenda for peace. But as we discuss a new agenda for peace, we must not jettison the foundation of the United Nations, the foundation that is designed to prevent humanity from going to hell. As Dag Hammarskjöld said it many decades ago. And that is the Charter, the principles of international law, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, all these foundational documents, we are not going to reinvent them. We are not, as we begin a new era of network multilateralism, we're not going to jettison the foundations. So I think for many countries, including Singapore, there was a sense that the Pact of the Future must also be an occasion to reinforce the foundation of this architecture, because the foundations are being shaken, sometimes in a determined way, sometimes in an unintended way, but they are being shaken. So we have to protect this architecture. Second, that leads me to the point about what additional toolbox do we need, even as we preserve the foundation. And that's where the whole area of preventive diplomacy, confidence-building measures, in my view, becomes very important. Preventive diplomacy, confidence-building measures, mediation, and the role of the Secretary General using Article 99 of the Charter. I think there's a lot of scope there for not just members of the United Nations and the United Nations Secretariat, but also for civil society to advocate and agitate for more proactive roles in the area of confidence building, mediation, and prevention. So there too, I think that gives us a window for further action. The last thing is in the area of new and emerging technologies. And this is where the exciting bits of the new agenda for peace can come. There is lethal and autonomous weapons, there's cyber security, ICT security as it is called, there is the whole question of outer space and the increasing congestion and contestation in outer space, which is going to harm ordinary people because a lot of services are being delivered through an architecture of satellites that cannot be weaponized, let alone be destroyed unilaterally. So there too, there's a whole area of building norms, building regulations, whether it's AI, cybersecurity, or lethal and autonomous weapons, and how we govern cyberspace. So there too, there's a lot of work to be done. I'll end with a final point, which is two concepts embedded in the Pact for the Future, Chapter 2. Look at it, is what we diplomats affectionately call WPS and YPS, Women, Peace and Security, and Youth, Peace and Security. That is the arena for network multilateralism to agitate and pressure for changes. And that is an area where I think we must really change the traditional approach to peace and security. The traditional approach to peace and security was an interstate conflict. The UN would interpose itself between two warring parties, and peace was kept when there was peace to keep. But now there is no peace to keep, and how does one engender peace? And this is where the whole notion of network multilateralism, confidence-building measures, mediation, and activist Secretary General using his Article 99, using her Article 99 powers, will be able to really make a bigger contribution than has been the case. So youth, peace, and security is also an area I think young people need to be part of this conversation, because they are the foundation, not just in a particular society, community, in a country, but also a region. I see the time, I stop. I have 10 more pages of notes.
Thank you again, Ambassador Ghafour, for your tireless advocacy of multilateralism in these negotiations. Next, we are moving on to the Global Digital Compact, Science, Technology, Innovation, and Global Cooperation in the Pact for the Future and its annexes. So we have Philip Shanrock from CEPE.
Good evening, everyone. Wow. I wanted to actually steal Anna Marie's line of "we are feeling already old after this negotiation," but since it looks like I have no authority, I will stick to my plan and actually borrow some of your words to start with, nor talking about starlings, because where I come from, we have parrots. And this is why I will talk about how we implement actually the Global Digital Compact in the Global South, because it is a real important moment for the implementation to go back to the regions and the countries. Governments, as well as policymakers and development stakeholders as a whole, need to address not only the challenges, but also the opportunities that we have to implement the Global Digital Compact, and in my case, in Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at this as an opportunity to demand new collaboration and to offer it as well, as multi-stakeholder forms of global governments and democratic participation that transcend, of course, the national boundaries and borders as well. We believe that we need to create regional public goods in order to implement the GDC. This is why it is extremely important for us to talk about connectivity, the data use, the governance of AI, of course, and not duplicating nor replicating, actually creating our own model. Of course, cybersecurity will require that greater international cooperation. So this is why we also look at some of the challenges that we have, because we cannot only leave it on a positive note, we have to talk about the reality. And our reality brings first, an existing infrastructure gaps that we still have, and they are broadening, and the digital divide is opening as we speak. We have access inequalities, especially for women in our region. More than 40% of women in Latin America and the Caribbean do not have access to internet, and we should have that very much in mind. The harmonization of policies, going back on global public or regional goods, the data protection and privacy and regulatory frameworks. At the end, I believe we aim to implement this GDC by shared principles for an open, free, and also secure digital future by focusing on the following: the universal and meaningful connectivity, the data governance, and I believe with ethical guidelines that are extremely important, and the regional cooperation. And here I would like to leave a comment on how we actually work within governments, with civil society, think tanks, tech companies, and what is the enabling environment in order to do so, because that's a missing point we have not brought back to the regions nor the countries, and I think it's the first task that we need to do. I think my time is up, and it's a thank you to you.
Thank you, Philip. I always appreciate you bringing it back to the regions and where the rubber hits the road, where we really need to focus on these issues. Gordon LaForge from New America Planetary Politics.
Thank you, Mintu. So one thing the Global Digital Compact does is spell out the UN's plans for global AI governance. And these include creating 3 new institutions within the UN. One, an independent scientific panel on AI that would advance a shared understanding of AI and then issue clear-eyed assessments about benefits and risks. This idea of a IPCC for AI is very popular. Many have proposed it. Second, there's a global dialogue on AI governance, which would be a regular high-level discussion forum held on the margins of major UN meetings. And then 3, a global fund on AI that would stimulate blended financing to help build AI capacity and address issues in access and gaps for sustainable development. So these proposed institutions are not sufficient for global AI governance, but they are necessary. So AI is not nuclear weapons, it's not social media, but it's rather a foundational technology that is going to affect every sector, it's going to affect every country, and it's going to require different governing frameworks depending on the domain. So we're not going to have some single international AI agency or treaty that can do all that. It's going to depend on an ecosystem of agreements, clubs, standards, and other mechanisms at all levels. And with the compact, the UN is showing that it has an indispensable role in that ecosystem. One, it can help furnish a truly global, trusted scientific consensus around AI, as it has done with climate change. And 2, it can help put a floor on the north-south divide in not just AI capability, but in AI governance itself. Right now, AI governance and policymaking is dominated by the rich world, and there's a big need to close that gap and make the majority world a bigger part of it. AI risks exacerbating global inequalities and creating a world of AI haves and have-nots. So with the dialogue and the Global Fund, the UN is elevating the concerns and priorities of developing countries and small and medium-sized states in AI governance. Now, the compact leaves it up to member states and the SG's office to flesh out the specifics of these institutions and to actually bring them into being. There are excellent recommendations in the high-level advisory body's recent report, the final report, that provide a great framework for doing this. And if these institutions are well designed, which by the way means that there will have to be radically strong participation from civil society and from the private sector, because the cutting edge AI models are being built by private companies, and most of the capacity for research and oversight is in civil society, more so than governments. If all that can happen, then these bodies will help AI be not just safer, but more equitable globally.
Thank you so much. And I told you that coming here, you get a rapid fire analysis of what is actually in the pact. Hopefully you'll all read it anyway. I see that some of our negotiators and the leaders of the negotiations are here. Thank you for being here. Hopefully we're being accurate in what we have pulled out of the summit outcome. Next, we're moving on to the Declaration on Future Generations and Youth. Alicia, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here, not just at this global convening, but on the traditional and sacred lands of the Munsee Lenape and Mohican peoples. And I'm joining from the perspective of a next generation leader to point out that a lot of the work noted in the Declaration on Future Generations is already being pursued with ingenuity, inclusivity, and audaciousness by young people around the world. My fellow fellows and I are hard at work in our communities, leading on noted actions and commitments, like the work of Kristang Cultural and Lingual Revitalization by Kevin Martins Wong in Singapore, Making Tax System Reform Cool for Youth by Thomas Walker in Australia, foresight education specific to the Latin American context, led by Andres Arruda in Brazil, Indigenous Futures Methodologies by Alice Diamond in what is currently New Zealand, and other work on diverse and pluralistic futures methods around the world, feminist futures, gender parity in STEM, futures methods and storytelling in a variety of applications from the Congo Basin to many other projects spanning Nigeria to Cameroon to Pakistan, India, Brazil, Colombia, Uganda, South Africa, Portugal, and my own work in Canada and the Caribbean. Please do look these up and more on our website. We should never underestimate the power of stories, of new narratives to chart our path forward to better futures. But I'm not here simply to repeat the fact that young people require more funding, more access, and fewer barriers to decision-making spaces. If you do have funding available, talk to me later. I'll be chatting. More critically, what I'm calling attention to today is that youth-led futures and foresight can be leveraged to create effective intergenerational discussions and to validate information about our uncertain futures in order to better inform policymaking processes. Youth and futures are a powerful combination to help bring about change and to uncover insights about the future yet to emerge. Thus, youth-led futures and foresight work is key to the successful implementation of the actions highlighted in the Declaration and in the Pact overall. From constructive methods for intergenerational dialogue to innovative approaches for the policymaking challenges facing us, as well as effective advocacy and futures literacy campaigns, young futures and foresight leaders are a critical resource that we cannot afford to overlook in the days ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Sophie Howe, former Commissioner for the Future Generations in Wales.
Thank you. So I think there's lots to be excited about in the Future Generations Declaration as the first person in the world, and I hope that there will be many, many more to come, to hold statutory powers to oversee the implementation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales and hold our government to account on how they were acting in the interests of future generations. I'm really pleased to see some powerful wording in the declaration, particularly the commitments and actions around undertaking a whole-of-government approach to coordination at national and local level on the assessment, development and evaluation of policies which safeguard the needs and interests of future generations, because it really does take that whole system approach. I think what we're saying in this declaration, and I inspired by my friends to the right here and their use of music. So I see your Mick Jagger and your Elvis, and I raise you the Manic Street Preachers, who are in fact a Welsh band, who said, if we tolerate this, then your children will be next. And I think it's absolutely inspiring that the UN system has really taken a grip of that and is now embedding this declaration on future generations in this multilateral space. But of course we know that it's a symbiotic relationship between what happens in country and what happens in the multilateral space. And we also know that institutions tend often to take an easy route in terms of implementation. So we could have transformative implementation of this declaration, or we could have performative implementation of this declaration. And without accountability in the form of what I would advocate is commissioners in countries, the special envoy at the multilateral level, there really is a risk that member states and the UN system ends up ticking the box and completely missing the point. So whilst I'm really excited about the opportunity that this presents, we need to make sure that built into the implementation is support, resourcing, convening and coordinating, learning from some of the brilliant things that Alicia and others are involved in, and making sure that we really are seizing this moment for transformation for the next generation, so that what comes next for our children is a brilliant and bright future.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Tom Hale, Future Climate Cooperation.
Thank you, Mintu. So let me just add on this idea of going from performative implementation to transformative implementation. And I think Sophie and others are exactly right, that this Declaration on Future Generations has a huge potential to catalyze changes. And we know that because they're already happening. Alicia spoke to some of them. We saw earlier, Sophie's experience in Wales was obviously a stellar example. We've seen this week the European Commission appoint a commissioner whose portfolio will include intergenerational responsibility. This month, the future generations of South Korea were protected by their constitutional court through an order forcing the government to increase its action on climate change. So it's happening, and the potential here is exciting because this declaration may catalyze more action. But how does catalyzing happen? Is it just about writing a text in New York and hoping that that goes out into the ether? That can help, but obviously catalyzation requires work. And the Secretary General himself said exactly this today in the opening ceremony of these action days, when he said we must breathe life into this. So the declaration does have a final 42nd paragraph about implementation. And I think it's really important to think about this, of course, as mostly a project for civil society, for network multilateralism, for countries. But the UN and the multilateral system has an ongoing support function to play. And I think it's also important that we see that continue beyond today and tomorrow and this week. So in the implementation paragraph, we have a report that will be issued on the implementation. The Secretariat will write. We have a forum on future generations, which will take place in 2028. And we have a noting of this idea of a special envoy. And so now the ball is really in the court of the Secretary General and his team to think about how we take that forward. But of course, we've also heard today at an event just a few hours ago, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, one of the two countries facilitating the negotiations on the declaration, say that they will take forward a Friends of Future Generations group. So those member states will be taking a strong role in helping this agenda grow going forward. And of course, because we're thinking about networked multilateralism, we also have an impact coalition around the Future Generations agenda, which is already working very hard to think about this. So we have a lot of the elements of a catalyst here, and the challenge for us going forward is to really make that catalyzation happen so that we can come back here, hopefully before 2028, but at least by then, and show all the more people who are doing Sophie's job, who are doing the work that Lisa's described, and doing this fantastic implementation work. And you know, future generations is quite abstract. It can seem like everything, but that's also the opportunity is for every individual nation, every community to define what that means for themselves. And if we have a multilateral system that's really responsive to that, that's a beautiful network that we can see emerging from this summit. Thank you.
I love this. I want to comment on every speaker, but I won't. Okay, we're moving on to transformation of global, transforming global governance. I think in terms of expectations of the Pact of the Future, they are incredibly high. I think there is every expectation that the Pact for the Future will be agreed and adopted tomorrow. And I think it really culminates in this last chapter on transforming global governance. So we've got a great set of speakers here. David Passarelli from UNU Center for Policy Research, Maya Rafale from Plataforma CIPO, and Dan Perel from C4UN and Baha'i International. David.
I was to say I've spent the last 20 minutes thinking about a song, and I don't have one, so sorry to let you down. The origin of this focus on global governance reform, I think it's found in 2020, the UN 75 Declaration. Member states pledged to strengthen coordination and global governance for the common good of present and coming generations. And since that time, 4 years on, what we have today is 19 action paragraphs that spell out what some of those commitments might be. And over this period of time, I think few issues have received as much attention as the reform of the international financial architecture. And many of the paragraphs in Chapter 5 touch on this, and this is what I want to speak about. And I think what we've also seen over 4 years is a pretty dramatic shift in global opinion. The message is clear, it's consistent, and it can be heard in every region. The instruments and institutions of global economic governance are performing well below their potential. And some of this criticism, I think, is clearly warranted. We've heard it from global leaders. We've heard it from leaders of the international financial institutions as well. It is difficult to defend global institutions with a forward-looking mandate that adhere to customs, rules, and conventions developed in an era of old alliances. The Pact for the Future, and specifically Chapter 5, I think does two important things. It balances the recognition of change underway right now. As Tom just said, change is happening, and it compels us to more action. I think it's important to note the change that we have seen over the last 4 years. The AU has a new seat in the G20. The IMF Board of Governors has approved the expansion of the board to a 25th chair for sub-Saharan Africa. And we have seen the IMF's resources, through a doubling of the quota, raise its permanent resources to 960 billion, strengthening the global financial safety net. But I want to draw some attention to what the Pact actually says and what it does. And I think first, the Pact does ratchet up some ambition. Kristalina Georgieva, just a few weeks ago, said that in 2021, they called for 20% of rechanneling of SDRs from the 2021 allocation. That then went to 30%. At the Paris summit, it went to 40%. This pact calls for 50% of the rechanneling. That is not nothing. Those targets matter. So I think we should look at the pact as offering some new ambition and ratcheting up that ambition. We see a commitment to a new quota formula at the IMF. That is answering one of the key demands from the Global South, improved voice and representation. We don't know what the outcome of that review will be, but it offers an opportunity. Second, I think this chapter magnifies overlapping consensus. We have seen solutions emerge in different places. We have seen attention to new challenges. The pre to post-pandemic period, we've seen 8 countries move to 22 countries facing IMF surcharges. And in the Pact for the Future in Chapter 5, we call attention to a new surcharge policy review. Finally, I think Chapter 5 invites the UN to occupy a greater space in global economic governance. It sets the groundwork for a biennial summit, bringing the UN to the table with IFI leaders. It gives the Secretary General a role in engaging with credit rating agencies for reform and transparency. And it launches processes to review the global debt architecture, to review how we use GDP and to move beyond GDP, and creates new task forces. But I think really the ultimate value of this process is not even the Pact for the Future. It's the process that led up to it. And over that time, it has created coalitions and alliances that didn't exist before. The Bridgetown Initiative is new just in the last couple of years. The African High-Level Working Group on International Financial Architecture Reform is new. The Paris Pact for People and the Planet is new. Project Starling is new. And I think we can take some inspiration from this. And I think that's where we need to pick up from. These coalitions and alliances to ensure that we support the recommendations and the ratcheting up of ambition in the Pact for the Future. Thank you, Mintu.
Mayara.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Well, so for those who have already had a chance to read what we hope to be the final version of the Pact, which I'm sure it's most of you, because I know I'm a bunch of UN nerds, you will notice that Chapter 5 quite clearly states that the reform of the international financial architecture is a necessary step for reestablishing trust in the multilateral system. And more specifically, Action 45 of the Pact emphasizes the need to place the Agenda 2030 and poverty eradication efforts in particular at the center of any meaningful reform of the international financial institutions. And this is not least because, as my colleague from Oxfam very well mentioned, we are facing a hunger crisis, right? Currently, 700 million people live in extreme poverty. Almost or nearly 1/3 of the global population, that's 2.3 billion people, are suffering from food insecurity. And meanwhile, the accumulated wealth of the already rich companies and rich individuals continue to grow despite the modest but significant progress that we've seen in terms of the taxation agenda. So it goes without saying that the legitimacy of the multilateral system will continue to suffer if we do not place the inequality reduction agenda at the core of the global attention. But I know that when we talk about inequality, this sometimes either might sound too vague or too ambitious, and something that's quite difficult to achieve. But since we are trying to think a little bit in terms of actions and what's going on in the world, Brazil, within its G20 presidency, is offering quite a concrete pathway to try to raise the profile of this agenda through the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. This is an initiative that will be launched in Rio officially this November, and it seeks to not only build capacity and disseminate knowledge, but most importantly, to raise the resources and the finance that are necessary to implement a pool of public policies that have proven to work in the past to reduce hunger and poverty. And this alliance will be open not only to governments and member states, but also to multilateral banks, international financial institutions, philanthropies, etc. So as we move forward, I think it would be important for groups like ours to get to know about this alliance, but also to encourage adherence to it, because I do believe there is a very concrete measure to accelerate the SDGs implementation and the goals of the Summit of the Future in terms of placing greater attention to the reduction of social inequality. Thank you.
Dan, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I'll start by agreeing with the previous speakers, and because of the technical expertise that they contributed, I'll actually focus more at the level of principle. There's a line in Chapter 5 that says we must renew trust in global institutions by making them more representative of and responsive to today's world and more effective at delivering on the commitments that we have made to one another and our people. I think ultimately any effort to increase trust is an effort worth making, and so one thing that I am thinking about is trajectories. How will our commitment to agreements made be different after the summit from before? Are we still going to enter these same cycles of words on a page, or are we actually going to make good on increasing trust? Imagine a world where we trusted our institutions because they were trustworthy. This is a different type of world than that in which we live today. We can see with increasing clarity that we're interdependent, and we have clarity on this principle right up until the point where our interdependence begins to harm our short-term interests. At the international level, we see tension between national and global. Global solidarity is unshakable unless it infringes on domestic policy, with a few notable exceptions. So we hopefully will see a shift in the trajectory of the percentage of commitments being met after the summit, and I think that's something worth tracking. The last thing I'd say on Chapter 5 is that the UN would benefit from a dedicated space to talk about governance itself. We have so many spaces for climate governance and weapons governance and human rights, and all of that is important. But one thing that excites me about this sort of space is that we're talking about governance as a principle. And I hope that we can continue to do so in the future. And I will end with the song. It took me a while to come up with it, and I apologize in advance. You're about to be rickrolled, because to the UN, we should say, never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down.
Oh dear, everyone will have that one in their head for a long time. Thank you, Dan, for that. So as you see, there is so much in the Pact for the Future and its annexes, Declaration on Future Generations and the Global Digital Compact, for us to harvest and move forward. And this is just a quick snapshot. The immense amount of work that the diplomats have put into this over the last, actually, 4 years is worth actually reading. I do think the Pact is a readable document, and having gone through many of these things, you don't always get that in a UN resolution. So I will say that. And now, so all of these think tanks and NGOs that we've brought together, you'll see the energy that they're bringing, the intellectual heft, and the passion that they bring to these issues. And this is really just to showcase a small snapshot of them. There are some people who could not be here in person, who are on our website. Their logos are there. Amazing groups, especially in Africa, who, for many reasons, were not able to be here in person with us, but there are lots of groups involved in this effort. So I'm turning now to my colleague, Stuart Patrick, who is the director of the Global Governance, Global Order and Institutions Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to ask him, a longtime observer of international governance, what's at stake if we fail to follow through with our commitments?
Well, thank you very much, Mintu. And first, I want to congratulate you and commend you, Hilary Landfried, and the rest of your colleagues at Project Starling for your logistical wizardry and intellectual leadership over the past year. This has really been amazing. Yeah, I do want to focus a little bit on what's at stake if the world fails to agree upon or to implement the Pact for the Future that's before us. I think one can, it's fair to say one can exaggerate the importance of high-minded outcome documents. But I think in this case, the inability of member states to reach an agreement or to implement a blueprint for the future once they do would lead to profound international disillusionment. I think failure would further undermine confidence in the entire multilateral system stalling much of the fragile and tentative progress that we've seen on the 2030 agenda and much of the rest of the initiatives that the international community has tried to work on over the last several years. I think the failure of the Pact would point to a very different future than the Secretary General had in mind and many of the champions of the Pact have in mind. I think it would advance a world in which the legitimacy of foundational international institutions, starting with the UN Charter and international law itself, would continue to decline. I think it would hasten a world in which the estrangement of the global haves and the global have-nots continues to grow, the estrangement between them, that is. It would hasten a world of even greater geopolitical rivalry and fragmentation and of deepening inequality and injustice. And I think it would energize populists and nationalists, not least in this country, but elsewhere. And I think it would embolden tyrants and human rights abusers around the world. It would leave the world less safe and prepared to manage looming technological risks and benefit from the digital opportunities that arise. And I think it would prolong and intensify humanity's unrelenting war against nature. All of these items are addressed within the Pact. There is a blueprint for at least some incremental progress in addressing them. And I think not agreeing on such a document, but also not implementing that document would leave us unprepared to address these. And I think this would be a tragedy and an irony, because what we've seen through this arduous negotiation process over the past year, the multiple revisions, is that the vast majority of UN member states are actually in favor of multilateralism. Where they disagree, by and large, is on the terms on which that multilateralism should occur, on the distribution of costs and benefits, on the relative balance of privileges and obligations. And many of those disagreements are long-standing. And I think that actually the facilitators have done an amazing job in actually trying to bridge those differences. And if we can avoid a few spoilers getting in the way, I think we're going to actually have an amazing document. I do remain hopeful that UN member states will agree to a robust pact, but even if they do, it will be imperative to track and hold governments accountable for the commitments that they make and to encourage them to deepen those commitments in the ensuing months and years. This is all, after all, that bears repeating, a pact for the future. This is not a one-and-done event. And I think this independent transnational network has a pivotal role to play in holding governments accountable and monitoring and reporting their progress, or lack thereof, not just in 4 years, as the pact envisioned, but actually through an ongoing effort to try to hold them accountable. And I think we are ideally situated to do that. And I look forward to working with all of you in helping everyone in this room in helping hold governments accountable. Thank you.
Okay, Marianne is a researcher who I often look to as being the person to tell us exactly how we do follow-up and review, not only in the high-level political forum that tracks the SDGs, but also more broadly in these systems. So Marianne, what are your thoughts on how a networked approach can help us follow up on the Pact?
Thank you, Mintu. I have to say that I was intrigued with the twofold approach that the Global Digital Compact foresees, and that fits very well with a networked and inclusive approach. On the one hand, they want to use all existing fora for implementation and follow-up and review, such as various digital fora, UNDP, and others, and then a high-level review during the 82nd session based on a progress report by the Secretary General and with the input and meaningful participation of all stakeholders. So that is networked and inclusive. The Pact for the Future points in a similar direction in para 17. They say, we will advance implementation of these actions through relevant mandated intergovernmental processes where they exist. And second, we'll review the overall implementation of the Pact at the beginning of the 83rd session, GA session, through a meeting at the level of heads in state and government. Plus, we have Action 55 on partnerships with non-state and sub-state actors, which commits member states to ensuring that all relevant stakeholders can participate meaningfully. Of course, all this needs to be further specified. Who is a relevant stakeholder, and how could the UN improve its framework so that it makes non-state participation more meaningful? Academic literature, for example, points out a more interactive process of agenda setting and opinion building would be required. But so far, we have no regular space for non-governmental participation in GA processes. It's always a stretch to get something in the modalities resolution, and then it pretty much depends on the COFAX. So further development of this should be part of the follow-up to Action 55. Also, we need to build capacity and prepare for the high-level review in September in 28. And since the Pact does not mandate an SG report, we as think tanks and NGOs, just as we heard from Patrick, we need to contribute to the preparatory process with our own assessments. We can help build a multi-level public accountability system. And as for a song, maybe some punk, hey ho, let's go.
Okay, great. Tracy is with Southern Voice, an amazing network of think tanks from the Global South. Tracy, what do you think is the role of think tanks in the Global South, and what are our next steps?
Thank you, Mintu. Let me begin by briefly introducing Southern Voice. We're a network of 70 think tanks based in countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, working collectively to address the knowledge asymmetry still today underlying global development debates. So one consideration heard a lot, which is particularly valuable now that we are here at the Summit of the Future, is that neither the Summit nor the Pact are an end-all. So what next? While the focus remains on accelerating the achievement of the SDGs, Southern Voice has started engaging its members to understand a little better their perspectives on the experience of the 2030 Agenda and approach what should follow. 3 issues overwhelmingly emerge from this: localization, flexibility, and adaptation over time. We should consider these lessons as we think of how the commitments in the final Pact for the Future will be implemented and followed upon. Going from words to action will entail different decisions depending on the particular circumstances of a given context. Similarly, the context will evolve from the one in which the Pact was agreed, and so while the commitments may remain unchanged, the way they are put into practice is likely to evolve. Think tanks across the Global South bring forward on an ongoing basis knowledge to accelerate the achievement of priority objectives in their countries. But they also have a key part to play in providing timely, contextualized evidence to help ensure that efforts at the international level are and remain aligned with efforts to address various challenges on the ground. As Southern Voice, we're ready to play our part in bridging the gap, but to achieve the best results, it will be essential that the level of engagement with various constituencies that led to the first version of the Pact and its annexes be at least maintained and become more systematic through all the various spaces and processes involved in the follow-up on various commitments. Thank you.
Great. We next have Giovanna Coelho from the Igarape Institute in Brazil. I wanted to ask you, how do we make the Summit of the Future count at the national level?
Thank you, Mintu, and thank you for convening us here. So the Summit of the Future will not fulfill every expectation, but one crucial question is how it can drive meaningful action at the national and local levels. For this to happen, member states must align their policies and institutions with the global commitments they make. So the summit serves as a platform to address our shared challenges and provides an opportunity to ensure that no one is left behind. At the Igarape Institute, we prioritize connecting the global, regional, national, and local levels, and this flows in both directions. So I would like to share our experience with the UNSG's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, where Ilona, our president, served with Anne-Marie, as an example, because these exemplify how we can make documents like the Pact for the Future count at the national level by making it responsive to the peoples on the ground. So the HLab report, as you know, was launched last year, and it provided input to the Summit of the Future by proposing some bold ideas, such as a pact for the people and the planet and a comprehensive decarbonization package to accelerate the transition to a post-fossil fuel era. So while many of these proposals were not included in the current version of the Pact, the process itself was important because it helped to create political momentum to debate innovative ideas, engage civil society, and expand the dialogue around the global challenges we face. So the momentum we are living now is crucial as it lays the ground for ensuring that discussions at the international level translate into concrete actions at the national level. In Brazil, we've helped to translate Data Lab recommendations into practice, demonstrating how the Summit of the Future process can drive national level initiatives. This is evident in the adoption of the Ecological Transformation Plan, the launch of the Tropical Forest Fund last year, and the recent Pact for the Ecological Transformation, an agreement among Brazil's 3 branches of government. So these initiatives are just some tangible examples of how we are working to achieve the SDGs and the Paris Agreement while responding to global challenges with national and local solutions. Thank you.
I am so excited to meet, and actually haven't quite gotten to meet, Ndidi, the new CEO of the One Campaign. They are such amazing advocates and activists. And so I want to ask you, Ndidi, and welcome to New York. Thank you for being here. What role do activists play in bringing commitments to the Pact of the Future to fruition?
Thank you so much for this opportunity and congratulations for such an inspiring evening. On the theme of songs, the One Campaign was actually founded by an Irish singer, Bono. And as we start, I was thinking about which of his, so I think I take the cake here. And I was thinking about what song fits this moment, and it's stuck in a moment you can't get out of. Which I think fits it very nicely, because as I was sitting here, board chair Tom Preston sent me a text with the The Economist article that was just published, that it's been a brutal year for the most vulnerable countries. And his question to us was, what are we going to do about it? And one was founded really on the conviction that we can do something about it, and we have to get unstuck by partnering together. And over the last 20 years, we've been fighting for justice and equity. And we've seen the power of activists. I mean, through our work, we're able to take a stand on HIV/AIDS and get PEPFAR enacted and passed, and it has saved 25 million lives. We're able to work with many of you in this room to push for debt forgiveness and get about over $100 billion in debt forgiven during the Jubilee campaign. And I think it's that time again where we need the world to stand up and act. And what is the role of activists? To speak the truth, to challenge convention, to work alongside each other, and to take on the issues of our time. And we've heard each of the panelists talk about the issues of our time. But I think what we need is unusual voices and trusted messengers, because there's a period of trust that has been broken, and governments, unfortunately, are no longer trusted. And we have to hold them accountable. One data shows that giving is at a 50-year low by the G7. In fact, we looked at from 1974 to 2023, and this is the lowest we've seen in giving. And so there's no time to sit on the sidelines. So we're going to be galvanizing new stakeholders, many of you in the room, young people to be activists. We're launching a One Academy to reach 1 million young people with the skills and tools to raise their voices. And then we're going to be partnering with faith leaders and new trusted messengers at all levels of society, including celebrity voices. For me, I think what we're going to need is trust, authenticity, and an ability to ask courageous questions. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. Right now, we have to go fast and far. We don't have a choice. And we have to go quickly together. To do that, we need to leave our egos and logos at the door. We have to work with courage, integrity, accountability, and transparency. And we need to make sure we leave no one behind. I look forward to working with you all. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, I don't think I could have gotten here in my career without you two. So thank you so much for that. In fact, the song in my head, especially inspired by your comments, is Walk On. I love that. So finally, we are so grateful, first of all, let me say, for the member states who have helped us get here, the co-sponsored member states, Uruguay, Ireland, who couldn't be here today, the European Union, and I'm in Singapore, of course, Burhan Ghafour. I'm really grateful for you. And so Luc Bagor is the Director of Sustainable Development Policy and Coordination in the European Union. And I wanted to ask you to give us your closing thoughts on the Pact's importance in shifting global governance and how a networked approach, networked multilateralism can help us get there.
Thank you, Mintu. And thank you to all of you for the interesting panel, discussion, and an excellent event. And I'm pleased to be asked to say some words of closing. Indeed, a lot is at stake, and the Secretary General should be commended for not shying away from the challenges, but asking us all to step up and face them. And he managed to give a positive signal by gathering, bringing together leaders in times of geopolitical tensions to reflect on how to improve the multilateral system, to bridge divides, and to rebuild trust. And the discussion, in fact, today, has shown that there is a lot of good momentum for this. First, on the process of the summit, as European Union, we welcome that it has been more inclusive. And despite, of course, the intergovernmental nature of the negotiations and despite the room for doing more. This approach involving young people, civil society organization, private sector, etc., helped to bring the multilateralism system closer to its members and its citizens and increasing, I think, trust in it. Secondly, as to the content of the summit. First, I hope that the summit will be able to manage to adopt by consensus the action-oriented pact for the future, the global digital compact, and the declaration of future generations. It is now crucial to adopt those texts that are supported by an overwhelming majority. It shall not be spoiled by one or some. And the European Union is committed to work tirelessly with partners all over the world to achieve it. This will show concretely that multilateralism works. And with those texts, we advance on some important issues, even if for some priorities, the summit is still a stepping stone, in fact, for further progress to be achieved later. So I would like to point out some priorities for us. On global governance and the international financial architecture, a more inclusive voice and participation is still a priority, even if the process will be continued in the fourth Conference on Financing for Development next year in Sevilla, and of course, during the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. We are making progress in tabling the issues and finding language that are acceptable for all. On SDGs, for the European Union, turbocharging the implementation of the SDGs and attracting more financing are key priorities. And again, with the summit, I think that we are making progress on delivering on financing and accelerating the implementation. From our side, the European Union intends to mobilize up to 300 billion of investments for development cooperation by the end of 27, and through what we call Global Gateway Strategy, we operate a shift in the way of doing development cooperation by attracting investment from the European private sector beyond ODA, and to work closer with stakeholders like you, civil society, and local authorities. With the Global Digital Compact, we are taking huge steps forward on global digital governance that the EU, the European Union strongly welcomes, in particular the APPC for artificial intelligence that has been proposed by the President of the Commission 1 year ago. Finally, with the Declaration on Future Generations, the summit is making a point that youth and future generations should be involved in multilateral decision-making. So the EU took up a role in contributing to the outcomes. We have fighting for not backsliding on agreed commitments and to include a number of priorities on human rights, climate change, environment, international law, for example. and we have tried to be sometimes a bridge builder to find compromise. So I think that now the Pact of the Future and the Global Digital Compact, the Declaration on Future Generations, have established a vision and a sort of manual for a stronger and more effective multilateral system. It is a stepping stone, as many of the commitments, of course, will continue to progress over coming summits and processes. So in addition to all the stakeholders that are present around this table here, you can count on the European Union to remain fully engaged in the process by implementing the commitments. And we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
We are at the end and over time. I usually like to open this up for questions or comments, but we are out of time. But let me just say something that Anne-Marie opened this up with. The future is ours. This isn't about an agenda for the governments to execute on. It's really about how all of us need to do it. And the comments that you've heard from everyone here today shows the enthusiasm and the high expectations that we have, not only for the governments, but also for ourselves. And I want to just thank all of the negotiators who have worked tirelessly, who are in this room right now, and I'm looking at some of you over there in the corner, Cornelia and Amelie and others, for really getting us here. And I think we hope that we can get over the finish line. We are holding you to that part so then we can then take on our part of the job so that we can really get this done. The outcome is just words on a paper. We have to move from words to action. Stuart laid out what's at stake. You've all heard here the enthusiasm and the passion that we all have. We know that the world will be in a much, much worse place if we don't get this done. So I'm really inspired by all of you. Thank you so much. This is just the beginning. We as a group will be reconvening over the next few months to work this out. And we hope to see you again in a year and report on our progress. Thank you so much.